Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to call this planning meeting for the Town of Lincoln to order. First of all, we'll do a roll call of who all is here this evening. Starting from my far left, Councillor Diane Rangema, Councillor Paul McPherson, Mayor Easton, and on my right, Councillor Foster and Councillor Timmers. Staff with us this evening here. To my left is Kathleen Dale, who's the Director of Planning and Development. To my right is our CAO, Mike Kirkopoulos. To his right is Andrea Chambers, an Executive Assistant. In the back row, we have Matt Bruder, who's our Associate Director of Planning and Development. And then to his right, Paul Deaney, who's our Economic Development Officer. And in the gallery, we have Megan Burbeck, who's our Planning Sustainability student, and Matt from IT in the far back. Are there any declarations of interest from the committee this evening? Seeing none. And confirmation of the agenda. Any members wish to change the Councillor McPherson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wondered if we didn't want to put the final, I don't know that I don't have it up here on the screen, the IRFGOED report up underneath the Corneef report so that people may not want to stay for the rest of the agenda can leave. A suggestion? Thank you.
Does the committee have a pleasure on that? Is that acceptable? Okay, so we can certainly do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to move PL 1841 item G up to item B, right below PL 1835. So we don't have any, excuse me, we don't have any public hearings this evening. We have no delegations, and we have no correspondence. So we'll get right into the reports, being PL 18-35, zoning bylaw amendment application by Corneef Produce Incorporated. Are there any questions from committee members on that report? Councillor Foster?
So, first off, I, like everyone else, are quite pleased to see this application having come forward, and in fact, bringing this industry into town. Just a question through to staff. I'm more curious than anything else within this report. It discusses this as being a farm-based industrial use. So, what is the taxation that comes into play with that? And how does that appear within the municipality?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, properties in regards to taxation, so if a property is assessed as an industrial commercial use by MPAC, then commercial taxes are applied. In regards to whether or not that will happen, that's something that we can check further with our finance department.
Councillor Foster, I'm going to go to the CAO for a moment as well.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, because we've dealt, or very recently I've been dealing with a similar situation. MPAC is made aware of all zoning bylaw amendments, and so that follow-up almost happens automatically, and so we can definitely, I think, as Director Dale highlighted, follow up and get some clarification on that. But I know MPAC will be alerted of every zoning bylaw amendment that happens, as they typically are, and then we'll look at the details around this particular property and how they assess it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Councillor Timmers?
Thank you, Chair Thompson. I just wanted to, just wanted to look over my questions here. I think mostly I just want to make a statement. I really support this application. I'm quite pleased to see this facility moving into Lincoln. It's obvious by the 12 growers in Lincoln, they're very, very happy about this as well. So I just wanted to state that I'm in support of this application. So, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Seeing nobody else, I've got a motion moved by Councillor McPherson, seconded by Mayor Easton, that for the reasons outlined in PL 18-35, it's hereby recommended that zoning bylaw amendment application PLZBA 20180032 in the name of Corny Produce Incorporated be approved for the purpose of allowing an agricultural produce processing facility. Any questions to the motion? Committee's pleasure on the motion? The motion is carried. Second motion that goes with that motion, moved by Mayor Easton and seconded by Councillor McPherson, that the Planning Committee considered all written and oral submissions and agrees with the planning report analysis and recommendation, and finds that, subject to the conditions of approval, this application meets Planning Act criteria, is consistent with provincial policy statement, and complies with the growth plan, the Niagara Regional Official Plan, and the Town Official Plan. Any questions to that motion? Committee's pleasure on that motion? Thank you. That motion is carried. So because we've moved the agenda around a little bit, we're going to be dealing with item G, which is PL 18-41. Are there any questions from committee regarding the report? Councillor Foster?
I'm not exactly happy that we don't have an overview of these reports within our meetings, and so I would like to ask our director to give us a quick overview of what's going on with this report, because I know there have been some additional changes that have come into play, and I think it's critically important that we have those laid out so everybody in the audience as well as ourselves know.
Very good. Thank you, Councillor. I was actually going to go to Matt for an update on this, so please go ahead, Mr. Bruder.
Sure, through you, Mr. Chair. So as we had a public meeting a while back for this particular application, this application is for to permit a agricultural building with intention for storage of some equipment and some product that is used to support the greenhouse industry, specifically to with respect to irrigation components. What we're considering this in the context of provincial policy is this would be considered an agricultural related use. These types of uses are, there is wording in the provincial policy statement in the permitted agricultural uses guidelines that refer to farm related industrial operation, farm related commercial operation. That's what you're seeing here. With respect to the property specifically, it is a 1 acre lot, currently 0.5 acres of which are crop production. It's not a very big parcel, and typically our zoning bylaw, which is actually a bit antiquated when you take into context the most recent changes to provincial legislation, would require such an operation to be secondary to an agricultural use, i.e. crop production. However, when we again refer to provincial policy, these types of activities are permitted as long as they're of local benefit to the economy. They don't adversely affect any adjacent agriculture-related uses. They don't impact any neighbors. And in this specific case, the small lot size would not really be conducive to having such an operation be secondary, just due to the very small parcel size and limited availability for crop production in the first place. So staff feel that this is, for this particular property, this is an excellent way for the applicant to support the local agricultural community, and a good way to make the agriculturally zoned property viable. So that's essentially a brief summary.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Bruder. Mr. CAO, please go ahead, please.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I think Councillor Foster raises a good point in that this was a report that generated a lot of community input, a lot of community feedback, and we do have a member of our community that's here, and I think listening very intently in terms of where we go on here. I know I've been more involved in this particular planning report than I typically do in some planning reports because there was an effort to try to negotiate. And by negotiate, I mean some sort of compromise with the particular property owners. There's probably two issues that have been raised and two issues that were of concern as it related to this particular property. One was lot coverage, and that was subject of the zoning bylaw amendment, and that lot coverage was currently sitting at 20% of the particular lot, when 15% is the limit we have in place. The other issue, not anything necessarily set in policy, but rather a desire or a concern that if there was adjoining properties or neighboring properties, would the company in question, Airfcode, be purchasing those and expanding its particular footprint? In both those occasions, I've got in writing, definitely for the last few weeks, something from the president of Airfcode that speaks to an agreement that they are willing to sign further than what they've already provided me as relates to no plans to purchase neighboring property or no expansion plans in this particular location. I did reach out and try one last ditch effort today to Airfcode to talk about the lot coverage, and I did actually receive feedback approximately 2 hours ago. So definitely cutting it close from Upper Canada Consultants and from a William Heitkoop, who's a planner with Upper Canada Planning and Engineering Limited, that in consultation with his clients, they are ready to reduce the building envelope to reflect the 15% lot coverage as discussed and requested by the councillors at the public meeting. Since that time, they did submit a plan to Mr. Bruder. Again, all this happened at 2:54 p.m. Between then and now. And so they set out that they look forward to hearing back from committee and hopefully an approval. But we do have some of those particular details that we received at the very last minute. So again, I think it's important to highlight those two particular pieces because they were items that were of concern to the neighbors, to the residents in that particular area. And so I add that for council consideration and to council in terms of where we stand now.
Thank you, Mr. CEO. Mr. Bruder, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to further indicate, too, and I was remiss in mentioning that in addition to what our CAO just summarized, the applicant also, following the public meeting, or actually right before the public meeting, made some other changes to try to accommodate and address some of the input that they had received in terms of some of the landscaping that they've provided now to provide an aesthetic improvement for the building, and also citing moving the building further away from the street so as to minimize its presence from a streetscape point of view. So I also just wanted to add those couple of points.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bruder. Mr. Gianni, do you have any commentary?
Yes, Chair, thank you. Through you, I just, from a staff perspective, wanted to speak quickly to the report and mention two quick items in terms of my support for it. One, from an FDI perspective, as committee knows, we are trying to strive to send a message of open to business for committee, for companies, both domestically and internationally. So a multinational like Airfcode does help send us that message by supporting them through investment, jobs, and growth in our community. Secondly, as committee knows, we do have over 1.8 million square feet of greenhouse space in Lincoln. So Airfcode's business model is to create smart floors, as I put it, and part of it is water conservation. So as committee knows, over the years it has grown more expensive to operate greenhouse in terms of energy costs. So having a floor that does recycle water in a conservation or a conservative manner does help mitigate some of the costs for greenhouses. So in terms of my support, it's really a company that's coming into town supporting jobs and growth, and my hope in the future is that once they do have a beachhead in our community and start to increase their commercial aspect here, they then would open up a manufacturing facility in town, obviously an industrial park, to help construct their floors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Danny. Mr. Bruder, is there any examples that you know of similar situations in town?
Through you, Mr. Chair, there is some types of similar operations, I believe, where they offer kind of agriculturally related uses in terms of storing some equipment and whatnot. One of them, I believe, is Vale Court. I think it's Vale Court Greenhouses. It's over on or Valecourt Winery rather, and it's over on Green Lane, I believe. And yeah, Mr. Deanny, you might know about the other one too.
Yes, in terms of, through you, Chair, through to the committee, the one that Associate Director Bruder was referring to was Vale House Winery company that actually supports vineyard management that helps support vineyards in the community. And what they do is basically are in an agricultural space, but they have machinery and such that does help through the maintenance of vineyards, and their equipment is basically from industrial standpoint. They do go out into the community and vineyards and help support the agricultural community. So they are just ancillary to the actual agricultural production, but they're out there supporting through agricultural uses.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Foster?
Thank you. That was good, all the input. So first of all, with the motion itself, my assumption is that these recent items that have come in are accounted for within the motion itself, because I think we would be remiss to pass it without having that with it. Secondly, and you'd be surprised, sometimes I ask questions for a reason. My earlier one on taxation, with this particular piece of property as well, it's clear that this is, again, an agriculture-based industrial use that's going on. So I'm curious as to what the thinking process is that's going on with this particular application.
I am going to go back to the CAO momentarily on this. Who was doing double duty as the clerk this evening, so. Sorry, Councillor. Please go ahead, Mr. CAO.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, if the councillor could repeat his question. I'm trying to capture that one amendment in the holding provision to allow for the 15% lot coverage, as well as for written confirmation of the legal grounds for non-expansion. That being said, I'm at your discretion, Councillor, now.
So, okay, so my second question, and by the way, I was quite satisfied during the public process that the applicants were very clear that no industrial activity is going to be going on. There's no assembly of these items at that place. It's strictly storage. But again, as is noted within the report, this is an agriculture industrial application. So the question is are we also going to be, is this requesting that we have the appropriate zoning on this as well, and therefore the appropriate taxation?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, this was a conversation that did come up as we were heading into this particular meeting in terms of the appropriate taxation, and I think it is a conversation that requires us to really consult with MPAC and to, I think in a lot of detail clarify what this particular operation is, what the zoning that we've approved is, and how we feel it should be taxed appropriately.
Councillor, go ahead.
Okay, so just to be clear from my perspective on this, this is an interesting scenario where we have essentially a company that is doing industrial application within our communities, which is great, and I'm completely supportive of that going on, and I'm also supportive of this particular location. But this is not ancillary to the use on that particular piece of property. This is strictly a building that's used to store industrial equipment. And if we had it in any other area of our municipality, it would be taxed at an industrial rate, so, or the commercial industrial, as you mentioned earlier. So I really do hope that that's part and parcel of this particular report that's coming forward this evening.
Actually, I'm going to go to Kathleen because she's got some additional information in regards to your question.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I don't have an answer on the specifics of this one because we need further consultation with MPAC. But just to give you an example, the wineries in the community, they pay probably 4 different types of taxation. If there's a house on the property, they're going to pay residential taxes on the house. The farmland will pay agricultural taxes. A portion of a winery is considered industrial and will pay industrial taxes, and if there's a retail store, then the retail portion would pay commercial taxes.
Is that helpful, Councillor?
I'm sure staff will make sure that we have the appropriate taxation levels go into place with this, but let's just be careful with it, because this truly is not ancillary to the use of that particular piece of property, so we should be taxing accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor McPherson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just FYI, Mr. Bruder was kind enough to share the size of the 15%, and that would bring the building to 364 square meters. And for those of us that think in square feet, it is just slightly less than 4,000 square feet. So it is moving from roughly 5,300 square feet to about 3,980. So we're losing about 1,400 square feet, or the size of a bungalow. Now, full disclosure, was coming tonight to vote against it. And, the change in the size is significant. And I've had several conversations with Mr. Bruder around agricultural use and the interpretation of agricultural use. And my thinking along that lines, not knowing what the provincial government thinks, because I think the definition is so broad that you could approve this, and they may never lay a foot of floor in Lincoln. It could be Listowel. It could be Prince Edward County. It could be Niagara-on-the-Lake. It could be. I mean, they could also lay most of their floor in Lincoln, but we don't know that. So this is absolutely a business that's coming in that will need Southern Ontario to survive, I'm thinking, because of those 1.8 or whatever million feet of flooring. They're not all replacing it. So they're going to need to venture out from here, which is fine. It's a business that, we want to attract. A phone call this afternoon that said, hey, in fact, we've made a decision to move, and the move is going to be over the escarpment, or the move is going to be into the industrial park, would have had my 100% support. That this is, I fit in what is a piece of rural residential. If you look at exactly what this is, there are probably half a dozen bungalows or that size of home lining First Avenue. And they're all 30 or 35 feet from the road. They're not farms that are, the house is put 100 feet or 150 feet back. They are right on the road like any urban boundary residential property would be. So you look at this, and it's very similar across the street. You look at this particular stretch of about 6 or 7 homes are all sitting there right on top of the road. So and a 1 acre lot, it's a big residential lot. I mean, that's what it is. It's not a farm lot. There happens to be a beautiful orchard back there that I would suspect will be gone, but there is good reason to question the fit. Mr. Bruder and I have gone around and around and around on the provincial policy statement interpretation of in the area. And, my understanding is that can cross outside of our town borders when it talks about in the area. So, a very strong, provincial policy that, is somewhat, in maybe in this case, can we challenge that? I doubt we can. If that's the way it's being interpreted, it's difficult for us to say no to this and then have to face what we would have to face down the road. So, maybe just some comments around that. I also, had the question around taxes that Councillor Foster posed, because that was a question that did come up in the meeting we had, was a question around what is the taxes today and what is the taxes changed to as a result of this zoning change. So, you know, I really struggle with the PPS. You know, I really struggle with, you know, the looseness or what I would interpret as a very broad application to what is agricultural use, because, you know, to me, you could throw anything that is in a greenhouse, you know, steel, glass, lighting, whatever it is, and if their market is greenhouses, it's an agricultural use. So that's just personally, I struggle with that. You know, as I said earlier, the size of the building had me coming here saying no. Now they've changed that. So, you know, I can get behind this with all of the other changes that they proposed, where in the buildings at the far back end, there's landscaping around it, there's no transport trucks, there's, you know, trucks going in the morning and at night, and that's it. I mean, all the things that were promised seem to be telling us that Urfgood is willing to work with us. You know, just where I'm at, what I've been going through in this particular application. I know it's important to us, you know, certainly from a international economic development standpoint. That is certainly a factor here and needs to be part of this decision. I would say that today's developments have pleased me, that they are in fact ready to bring it within the 15%, and all that leaves for us to decide on is the application, the zoning, and how does it fit. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Mayor Easton?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know that we've had an opportunity to debate the official plan beyond the days that it was coming here in 2014 for approval. And so it's my interpretation of the official plan and all the discussion that I heard at the time that there was a desire to look at the green belt as a protection, if you will, for agricultural land, but that it was also going to be putting limitations on economic growth. Maybe that was unique to Lincoln because we have very, very little industrial land. And I know that in some other municipalities that are very rural, that they still have very narrow interpretations of what constitutes an industrial activity. However, that is not our official plan, and so I am always looking to make absolutely certain that we have a consistency in the way this policy is applied, because we have had a lot of applications for value-added activities, and this council in the last 4 years has looked at each of them, very, very consistently. And I think that we need to make sure that we continue to do that until the policy is changed, if it ever is. It was my understanding from the first application that Urfgood made was that they would be laying their floors in town, in Lincoln, and in the surrounding communities. If that's changed, then I would then have to look at where production is going from other farmland in terms of crops and other production that's going on. Where is all the horticulture going? It certainly isn't just going here. So I think that Councillor McPherson's comment is valid in the sense that we always hope that when people make applications, Mr. Chairman, that they follow through on what they tell us, because that we're going to make our decisions on that. I want to see all farmland in production. Every bit of farmland that can be in better production here. That's what my goal is as the mayor. And I think that that is one of the goals of this council. However, I think the fact that the strongly with many, many, many hard questions on this application is a very good sign. Because what happened was that it caused the applicants to review exactly what it was they wanted to do on the property. And enough time has passed that possibly this 15% is an indication that they're not placating a situation, but really doing that sober second thought on what do we really need here. So that tells me that they're clear about that. And it's good, that's good for the neighborhood. You know, I know this is a rural residential street, but I also see houses from original farms. And then, you know, a lot of our farmland has additional homes that were subject to farm severances when that was the order of the day. So there's very little that remains 100% original in any community. So I'm not really concerned about that. We have a policy that we are obliged to pay attention to. And we need to make sure that every application that comes forward gets the same consideration and that we aren't tilting at windmills when it comes to making decisions. And I'm satisfied that this is a good report for the applicant, and I believe that the neighbors have ensured that there's as much as they could achieve in terms of accommodation as they should. I think that's always very, very important. So I don't have a problem supporting this. I'm happy that this company is coming into town. I hope that they grow. Certainly, I've been into a number of greenhouses where their floors are being put in. We saw this company when we were in Holland. I think they're a good addition to the economy of Lincoln. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Any other comments from committee? Okay. I have a motion with regards to the report, moved by Councillor Foster, seconded by Councillor Timmers, that for the reasons outlined in PL 18-41, it's hereby recommended that the zoning bylaw amendment application PLZBA 2017-0209 in the name of Earthgood Canada Property Incorporated be approved and presented to council for approval. That a H holding provision remain on the zoning of the lands and that the H holding provision not be removed in all or part until the following conditions have been met. A, the applicant has entered into a site plan agreement and the agreement has been registered on title. B, the applicant has submitted the letter of credits and cash payments required by the agreement. C, that the lot coverage be limited to 15%. And D, that the proponents provide written confirmation of no expansion in the current location. Any questions to the motion? Councillor McPherson?
Question. I think there was discussion around 1 versus 2 driveways. Can we verify that now, whether there is 1 or 2?
Mr. Bruder?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Currently, as the latest iteration of the site plan shows, they are showing that they're retaining their existing one, they're proposing a new one. However, when we get into the subsequent site plan process, there's a whole process that is undergone with respect to confirming entrances, confirming their geometric size, configuration, how many on the property. So this is something that will be looked at again as we get into the more detailed engineering stage, should this go forward to the site plan process.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments? Councillor Foster?
Can we, through to staff, I think that's an important point. So I'm sure that's, again, contained within the documentation that's going to be going on, but perhaps through to the CAO, if you want to make a comment on that.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I think to that particular point, Councillor, and I know we just had a conversation with Mr. Rittiger, who asked for that confirmation before this meeting. I think further to what Mr. Bruder highlighted, we can go back and discuss both with the planning consultants and the president of the company, council's desire to see 1 driveway versus 2. and not make that a condition of the holding provision, but, let me go away and negotiate that piece and make it very clear that'll be an important element as we go through the site planning process.
Go ahead, Councillor.
And just one last thing, and I'm sorry I'm bringing it up under the motion section here, but the app during the process that we went through, that there's not going to be any manufacturing going on the property. This is storage only. So my assumption is that within this agreement, that will also be within it as well. I think that needs to be very clear, and it protects us so that this process, as the mayor has said, the public process, and we can keep it quite pristine as we go through this. So, thank you.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, staff can make sure that we put some sort of, or have some sort of conversation around industrial manufacturing and wording to that extent, and that this really be limited to, and I'll look to planning to give the exact wording, but it be limited to simply storage and those minor pieces that they describe versus any sort of manufacturing.
Mr. Bruder actually has a comment to that too, Councillor, just if I can have him interject there.
Yes, Mr. Chair. So I just wanted to add in very quickly that the draft bylaw that's already been put together by staff does refer to the use of the building for storage of agricultural cultivation, flooring, and equipment. It doesn't, there is no mention of the word manufacturing. It's very clear that that's what the intended use for that building is. So that's already been included in the bylaw, and will further articulate that in the site plan agreement.
Councillor, is that okay?
That's what I was going to say. The site plan, I think, is the appropriate spot for that. But sometimes silence isn't golden in some of these things, so we should probably make sure that it's stated. Thank you.
Madam Mayor?
Mr. Chairman, I'm looking at the size of equipment that is being stored on farms and the amount of minor manufacturing that goes on farms. I don't think that we can say that there isn't manufacturing occurring on farms, because there is. I just want to make sure that in doing this, by making these additions, that we aren't in some way violating the Farm Act. Because I don't know where, I'm just asking the question, because if we are adding things into this, which are considered part of, this is considered as a farm associated use. If we had a farmer and there was a farm associated use going on their property, would we be specific about some of these items? Would it be within our jurisdiction to be specific about these items in the site plan?
Mr. Bruder?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. I think that's a good point. With respect to, when we talk about, the use of the building and how we're stipulating that, I think it's kind of, there's two different points of rationale for that. First and foremost is I think we heard loud and clear from the applicant that, having this building for storage, that suits what they want to do. It doesn't sound like they need to do any type of other activity within the building. And the other thing too is I think we're also to work towards a good solution here for all sides. And I feel like we're doing that because of IRFGO's business model and some of the input we've received. It just seems like a good fit to highlight the building in this way.
Right. Mr. Chairman, I just want to reiterate my point that because we want to say something in a site plan because it makes us feel better, doesn't necessarily mean that we have the jurisdiction to do that. And I think when you're dealing with things like the Farm Act, which are out there and very prevalent, and Niagara North Federation of Agriculture don't waste any time telling us when we are off track on these things, that I just want to make sure that when we say these things, that they're the things that that we really have the purview to say and that we can then enforce.
Okay. Councillor Foster?
Just a quick comment on where the mayor is going with this, and I can understand her frustration potentially with this. However, the way planning works is that we do actually get to state on a planning situation by planning situation what's going on. And secondly, with this particular situation, a 1 acre parcel of land is not a viable farm. I don't care what anybody says. So the reality is that we have to be careful with this. I mean, the last thing that we want to see is suddenly a manufacturing plant, and you can take the public process that we went through and throw it right out the door. I can imagine Mr. Rediger, as well as everyone else, would be ready to lynch us at that point. So I think we as a council and as a municipality have to be very careful as we're getting into these things that are kind of edgy, if you want to put it that way. So my opinion anyway. Thank you.
I'm sure.
Chairman, fair enough, I think. Fair enough, and I thank Councillor Foster for his comments. I think that all of these things needed to be stated.
Certainly, I'm sure staff is going to vet through these things as the process goes forward. So, okay. So I've read the motion. Committee's pleasure on the motion. The motion is carried. Second portion of this motion, moved by, excuse me, Councillor Timmers, second by Councillor Foster. That the Planning Committee considered all the written and oral submissions and agrees with the planning report analysis and recommendations, and finds that subject to the conditions of approval, this application meets the Planning Act criteria, is consistent with the provincial policy statement, and complies with the growth plan, the Niagara Region official plan, and the town official plan. Any questions to that motion? Committee's pleasure on that motion? Thank you. That motion is carried. So we will get back to the regularly scheduled list here. Moving into report PL 1836, noise bylaw exemption application by Carmela Restivo. And I have a motion moved by Councillor McPherson and seconded by Mayor Easton that for reasons outlined in PL 18-36, it's hereby recommended that the noise bylaw exemption application 2018-02 by Carmela Restivo, as outlined in this report, be approved and subject to the following conditions. A, the applicant complies with the town noise bylaw and the exemption granted for the event date and times outlined in this report. The event organizer shall notify all neighboring property owners within 500 meters of the entire property boundary in writing a minimum of 10 days in advance of the start date of the event. A copy of the written notice shall be provided to the town for approval prior to being distributed. C, that the above notification shall provide the neighboring property owners with a direct telephone number to call during the event should neighbors experience any noise concerns. D, that the event organizer shall respond to and take appropriate corrective action to any noise complaints to minimize any disturbances from the event. E, if the town is required to respond to any legitimate noise complaints, the event organizer will be responsible for payment of the town's noise complaint inspection fee. Are there any questions to the report? Mayor Easton?
Mr. Chairman, I'm looking for some direction from the clerk on the fact that we have this report ahead of us this evening, in front of us this evening, but we also have a complaint in the bylaw department at the same time. I think normally we would deal with things separately, but I'm seeking advice from the clerk on how we would go forward here.
Mr. Clerk / CAO?
Through you, Mr. Chairman. I mean, I think the mayor is correct in that they are separate matters, and I think both are important. I think both will find their way into the conversation this evening, but they are mutually exclusive, yet connected in a number of ways. And so I think there is some discretion for council to ask staff questions in terms of what we're doing. Mr. Bruder did send out an email a little earlier today as it relates to the concert series and some resident complaint that we had over the weekend, and Mr. Breen is here this evening. and shared with me as I was walking in some of his particular comments. And I think there's always an opportunity for council to look at this particular approval in light of some recent events that have transpired, and potentially make any amendments or take different approaches or actions. So that would be my advice at this particular point in time.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple of questions then.
Please go ahead.
Under the section C, where it refers to a direct telephone call, where does this call go, and is there a live person at the end?
Through you, Mr. Chair. The intent of that particular condition is for the applicant to provide a number to the property owners when they provide their notification of the events. They should be circulating advance notification of the events to all the neighbors within 500 meters, and on that there should be a number that and a contact person on the applicant's side that the neighbor can call.
Okay, and so does that mean that there's a live person on the end of the phone, Mr. Chairman?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that is, yes, that's correct. That's how it should be.
Okay, and on the item D, the event organizer shall respond to and take appropriate corrective action. So I just want to be clear that if I'm the person on the job who's been charged with the responsibility to determine whether or not the noise is too much, I would guess by now that too much is going to be determined by a pattern of noise level that has been going on. I happen to know that the concert on Tuesday night was acceptable to the neighbors. So I think people are beginning to understand what's okay and what isn't okay. So if I'm the event organizer, or I'm the instrument of the event organizer, then that means that if I think the noise is too loud, that I'm going to say, you better tone it down. You're too noisy, or something to that effect. Is that how I should read that? Is that what I should understand? And should I understand that the event organizer is also delegating that responsibility to the person who's on the ground when this concert is taking place? Because I'm not sure that I understand how these ancillary decisions are being made on the event, on the night of the event.
Mr. Bruder?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Overall, that's kind of the general thought. Yes, the whole thing is this is an opportunity for the applicant to address the issue that's brought forward. Some of the thresholds and considerations that you're speaking of can be, as I understand it, rather subjective. But at the end of the day, when they receive complaints of this nature, yeah, it's up to them to, act based on the severity and their interpretation of what the complaint is. So I would agree overall.
All right, and Mr. Chairman, that being the case, if in fact there is a persistence to noise complaints, that eventually, on the advice of bylaw, that the committee or council could come to the conclusion that the event organizer really isn't able, that there isn't a capability on the ground, on the event, the night of the event, to make those decisions. Should I assume that as a committee member, as the mayor, who thinks that these ancillary activities on farmland are important? Should I assume that?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'm not sure that assumption should be made just yet. One of the actions that the staff plan to take in the very near future is to coordinate with the applicant with respect to this most recent complaint that we've had. We want to discuss maybe some additional opportunities other than what they've to attempt to mitigate some noise that's been occurring. So, I mean, at this point, I'd like to be able to have an opportunity to address that with the applicant first before we make any determination of that sort.
Okay, and in regard, Mr. Chairman, to the event this past weekend, I accept that and I understand it. I have faith that that will happen. But when it comes into here, this report, am I correct to interpret that statement D, just as Mr. Bruder and I have exchanged. Is that correct through you, Mr. Chairman, to Mr. Bruder? Okay, that's very good. Okay, and I'm assuming that under D, that this will happen immediately as soon as it's known that the noise is excessive. Is that a fair interpretation?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, that should be the objective of the applicant, to address issues as soon as possible.
Okay, thank you very much, because I think these things, these details, now that we've had a few go-arounds here, are going to be very important when it comes to approving applications that are exemptions. And I think that we are obliged to take those examples into consideration. But I well recognize that the one that Mr. Bruder's working on right now, he has more work to do. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I just have a quick question to Mr. Bruder with regards to this application for the noise bylaw exemption. I'm confused by the fact that it's been put forward by Carmela Restivo as opposed to Redstone. So further to the mayor's questions regarding who to contact, does Carmela now become responsible for this, or is Redstone responsible for this? Because that, in my opinion, is something that we need to really distinguish.
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's a good point. Why it was brought forward by this particular individual, she came forward with the initial application. She, exclusively said she was going to hold the event at Redstone. So basically the application is in her name. That's who's on the application form. So at the end of the day, these criteria would apply to the applicant. So, I mean, I'm sure that she would coordinate with Redstone in that regard, but at the end of the day, it's the responsibility of the applicant.
So further to that, the letters will be vetted by the bylaw at the town from Carmela, not from Redstone, to the neighbors.
Well, Mr. Chair, they could very well come from Redstone. It's up to her to coordinate such notification, that's all. I mean, at the end of the day, if she makes arrangement with Redstone, Redstone sends out all the letters, you know, as they typically would when their name is on the application. That would be fine, as long as it's done.
I'm just concerned that she's aware of what she's undertaking as a responsibility.
Yeah, that's a good point, Mr. Chair, and I'll be sure to follow up regardless and make sure that I reinforce that responsibility.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Foster?
Thank you. Kind of echoing what the mayor had to say, but maybe putting it a little different. You know, in good faith, when Redstone was in, we've moved forward basically saying, look, guys, get your act together and make sure that you're not disturbing the neighbors. And now we have one strike that's pretty clear. So here's the thing. It has to be very clear that Redstone is responsible for this as well, because they're the ones that have been in and they've been putting their reputation on the line as well. And you know, we as a council, I think we've basically said, we're behind you. We like the ancillary use. Here's the rules. Let's do this. But if there's flagrant violations continue down the road, then I think the council of the future will probably have some pretty significant differing views on what's going on with this stuff. So, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor McPherson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And when I first read this, you know, the first thought that came to mind was, oh my goodness, this is like 6 weeks away, maybe not even 6 weeks, like 5 weeks away. And God help us if we said no. You know, it just like, you know, what position are we in here, you know, from a approval point for a wedding that, you know, is coming to us at this particular time to request this deviation from the noise bylaw. You know, there's a lot in here that, you know, brings questions about, you know, it's in, it's out, you know, what is the music? Is it DJ? Is it band? Is it, I mean, there's just so many things here, but, you know, higher level, it's got to fit into the noise bylaw. You know, I guess I guess the only question I guess I would have is 1:00 a.m. in the morning. You know, is that reasonable from an outdoor standpoint? I know weddings go to that, and, you know, generally the dance floor is full till 1, and, you know, they're you know, having a good time. But, you know, with this particular situation, you know, is that a reasonable request? I don't know who would want to answer that.
Mr. Bird?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Staff's opinion, you know, when the application came in was kind of that nature, you know, that weddings do often go until 1 a.m. Given the conditions that were written into the report, as long as they're followed, you know, we did think that was reasonable when at the time of writing the report. So yes, that's what staff was bringing forward.
Counselor?
Yeah.
Okay. Mayor, did you have something?
Well, the only other thing, Mr. Chairman, that I would add is that knowing that this is coming on the 20th, do we know now that there will be a bylaw officer that will be assigned to duty that night?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, that's definitely going to be the case moving forward. We're going to make sure that we have a bylaw officer on shift when these events are occurring to make sure that there is somebody from the bylaw team available should a situation arise.
Okay, I think that's very important because a lot of this, a lot of these situations are not exactly the same every time they occur. And I want to make sure that the neighbors do have access to that, direct access to that person. So that if there are any judgments that need to be made, that person is going to be right on the spot. Are our bylaw officers, do they live far away, or can they respond quite quickly?
There's a couple that live outside of town, a couple inside of town. So I don't think that's an issue, though. I mean,
Okay.
I think as long as we work out the scheduling, that'll be fine.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We'll rely on that.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments to the report by committee members? Seeing none, I've read the motion. Committee's pleasure on that motion. Thank you. Motion is carried. Next report we have on the agenda is PL 1837, Draft Agricultural Impact Assessment Guidance Document. And I have a motion moved by Councillor Foster, seconded by Councillor Simmers, that report PL 1837 be received for information. Are there any questions or comments to the report? Seeing none?
Mr. Chairman?
Oh, Mayor?
This is a huge document, Mr. Chairman. I think it would be, we would really be remiss if we did not have a general overview provided. I mean, what is the impact of this on our community?
Thank you very much, Mayor. I'm going to go to our planning student.
For you, Mr. Chair.
Oh, it's Megan. Wow, yes, we definitely should
Megan's
have.
got the spotlight on this one,
We should definitely have
Madam Mayor.
Megan accounting.
It is a very long document that I did read the full thing of. But the general, it's a long document, but it was very broad, I found still. A lot of the stuff seemed to affect the upper tier, so the Niagara region, in terms of what an agricultural impact assessment would entail. So the agricultural impact assessment is when on agricultural land there's non-agricultural uses being done, but it was more in specific to 3 areas. So the settlement area boundary expansion, but the assessment would be done by the upper tier municipality in terms of when there's the municipal comprehensive review. So that's only when the settlement area boundary expansion would be done, or when an assessment would be done when there's that review being done, and that'd be done through the upper tier municipality in consultation with the lower municipality. So that wouldn't be on Lincoln to put together, but it'd be on Lincoln's portion to advise where they want their boundaries expanded. For the mineral extraction, that was on an applicant's, so if an applicant wanted to have that mineral expansion, it would be their job to put together that assessment. And then it was kind of unclear if it was the lower municipality or the upper tier municipality who would be receiving that assessment and who had to approve that assessment. So in the comments, if we were going to comment on this draft, to just have that clarification, because if there's not someone at the town who can approve that paper, then the town would have to consult on that, so that's onerous and money. So it just has to be clear of whose job that is. And for infrastructure, it mostly addressed transportation lanes, so like highways and transit ways, and it said that like an environmental assessment pretty much satisfied what an agricultural assessment would entail, but you just have to meet those. So then it was kind of confusing who was going to be approving that assessment again, if that answers your question.
All right, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for that. I guess then I don't really understand why this is necessary, because it's so nonspecific to the municipality. I'm not clear. I mean, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, well, there must be something that we would have to say about quarry expansion. I imagine those quarries are going to want to expand sometime soon. There's an issue about north-south escarpment crossing. There could be a mid-peninsula crossing issue. Would this come into any part of those discussions? Through you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Bruder?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, certainly. I think, when you're talking about expansion of quarries, there's often potential edge impacts on agricultural areas that could occur in some instances, and those would need to be assessed. So I think this definitely comes into that conversation in terms of crossings, roadworks, the safety for agricultural vehicles. That's all things that need to be considered, as well as impacts to agriculture. So yeah, I think it's definitely a component.
So, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for that, Mr. Bruder. When we get to page 33 of the report in Appendix A, there's a reference to mitigation measures. And I read this and I wasn't really clear about what this meant. Whose mitigation? Is it the town's mitigation? If they want to encourage different uses, if we want to remove lands, if we want to add lands, whose mitigation is this? Through you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. I think it depends on, who's initiating the change. When it comes to, things like what we talked about with quarry expansions, well, it would be, it would be on us to work with, the lower tier and the upper tier municipality would work with, the quarry operator to make sure that all the proper, evaluation of potential impacts and then, identification of mitigation measures where necessary are identified. If, we were looking at settlement area expansions in the future, That's something, I think would be in part and parcel incumbent on us too, to make sure that we evaluate what this means to the neighboring agricultural pieces, in terms of, like I mentioned before, vehicles traveling, in terms of what are the impacts on the viable agricultural operations on the neighboring properties, things of the like. So I think it's a joint responsibility, but it depends a lot on who's initiating the action.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, I know that the town has advised in the past, when the coordinated reviews were being done, on a number of properties that where we would desire to have taken out, for example. And we should, I would certainly want to clarify this through you to Director Dale, but it's my understanding that there was no advice taken at all, nor was there any advice taken from any of the communities in the region of Niagara. So again, I go back to, what is the purpose of the document? Maybe Ms. Dale could tell
Director
us
Dale?
what the story is on that.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, the mayor is quite correct that when the region and all of the local municipalities put forth comments on the changes to the growth plan and the Greenbelt plan, that there really weren't any changes requested by the region or the local municipalities. So right now, under current policy, who knows, maybe things will change, but under current policy, the way the Greenbelt plan is structured, we have no opportunities to expand our urban boundaries. There are municipalities that are not surrounded by the Greenbelt plan that may have opportunities to expand their boundaries. So this kind of documentation would be one of the evaluation tools for those areas under the current policy regime.
So what you're saying, Director, is it's not as applicable to us as it is to other municipalities?
Potentially, yes.
And Mr. Chairman, not to belabor this, but of course now we've had a change in government. Would this document have any merit at all in terms of any future policy changes that could take place regarding Greenbelt? Through you, sir.
Director?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, it really depends on what the next provincial government decides to do with those policy documents. So if there are some changes, then this could impact us. It really depends on what happens.
Okay. Thank you.
I understand that, Mr. Chairman. Through you to Ms. Dale, I do understand that. However, how significant is this document in terms of providing a response?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, so if we were one of those municipalities that could potentially expand our urban boundaries, a number of things that you have to look at when you look at making changes to your boundaries. One is what's the property currently being used for? Is it fragmented? Can it be serviced? There are a number of criteria, so this would be one of the criteria that would be looked at.
Okay, all right, thank you. I can see that this is just another piece of legislation that's come down from the province in the last few months with very little opportunity for comprehensive response, which could have very long, a big extension into our community. I guess I must be getting very tired of them, but this one really does not make a lot of sense to me. It may to the province, but doesn't to me. Thank you.
Councillor Timmers?
Thank you, Chair Thompson. I think Mayor Easton was kind of going along the lines that I was when I was sitting reading it today, and I was kind of trying to get my head around it, like where does this fit in with Greenbelt? Does it affect our town? How is it going to affect our town? And there's also this deadline, the consultation period ends July 13th, and I'm thinking about potential comments that the town should be making. Do we need to be concerned with the impacts? And I think you've kind of answered some of my questions. I guess I was just trying to figure out where it fits in and who would be involved in making comments on how this does affect us. I don't know who to direct that to, but I think Ms. Dale kind of answered some of my question. But so if we're mostly Greenbelt, so this is not These are more, this is more for municipalities outside of Greenbelt? With lands outside, is that correct, or?
Go ahead, Mrs. Chair.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, in the case of Greenbelt, in the case of expansions to your urban area boundaries, it affects in Niagara region, it would affect what the region does, because they're the ones that are responsible for looking at, if the boundaries are going to be expanded, they're the ones that would make the decision as to where, so it does definitely affect them more. Where it would affect us if there was a quarry expansion within the town of Lincoln, this would come into play if this policy document goes into effect.
Okay.
Does that help, Councillor?
Somewhat. I guess I'm just trying to figure out where it fits in, but it just seems like another layer, another
Question is, will
policy
it,
on top of what we can do. As far as the potential comments that the town should make, that will be coming through the planning, or stakeholders, or like who's at the table deciding on these comments?
Mr. Bruder?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Just in response to your earlier question, I think it, in large part and parcel, it does those municipalities that aren't so encompassed in the green belt as we are, for sure. As our director of planning indicated, there is, some minimal situations where this might impact us, like the potential quarry expansions. If there are, if this change in government or if any other circumstance does in the future lead to some settlement boundary expansions, that this would come into play. I think it, I would almost kind of liken it to, the process of undertaking an environmental impact study when you're proposing some type of development in or that could potentially impact a natural heritage area. This is kind of something similar, but relating to agriculture. In this case, at where we particularly stand now, I would say that there aren't too many instances where this would impact us. But in terms of stakeholders at the table, there's us, there's the upper tier municipalities in general. Obviously, OMAFRA being the major player there. So there's quite a few that, will be commenting.
Okay, I think your description there really cleared it for me. Like I get it now. Okay, thank you very much.
Just quickly, Mr. Chair, reading this report, the one thing that hit me was, we know that our lands are very valuable to tender fruit, and if we're to consider putting a greenhouse on top of one of those pieces of very valuable fertile land, does this come into play? You're putting your agriculture on top of agriculture, but you're putting a building on top of what is fantastic fertile land. So as I was reading this, I'm thinking, okay, how does that apply to, Jordan Road, where, we had talked about greenhouses going on to that beautiful land there? Through you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Bruder?
Yes, Mr. Chair. So short answer, no, this wouldn't come to light in that particular situation, because a greenhouse is widely accepted as an agricultural activity permitted as of right in agricultural land, both by our policies and upwards, when you get into provincial legislation. So no, this wouldn't be an inhibiting factor to a greenhouse. I get your point with respect to the tender fruit crops and, putting a greenhouse on top, but in this particular case, greenhouses are accepted as an agricultural use, so it wouldn't.
Councillor Rinjema?
Thank you, Chair Thompson. Do we have in our recent official plan update, through you, Mr. Chair, did we not put policies in there that in certain situations we would require an agricultural impact assessment? Was that not part of our recent official plan update?
Director Dale?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I don't have that in front of me, but it does sound familiar. Staff can provide a follow-up email to committee and council.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Go ahead, Mayor.
Maybe I don't. I was thinking of the school property is classed in the Greenbelt, correct? Through you, Mr. Chairman, to the CEO, that is classified as Greenbelt, correct?
Go ahead, Mr. CEO.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, to the mayor, parts of it are, that is correct, as well as a tender fruit designation on top of that.
Okay, so is there any piece of that would require an agricultural impact assessment? Would the industrial application?
Mr. Bruder?
Through you, Mr. Chair, for the school property,
Yes.
for that particular property, I don't believe that it would, because first of all, there's pre-existing zoning on that property that allows for industrial type uses, and there have been uses that are already non-agricultural, leading back to, predating the Greenbelt, I believe. So for that particular property, because there aren't any viable agricultural operations in the area, unless I'm mistaken, if there are any neighboring properties, perhaps it would be something that would need to be looked at for them, but my understanding for that particular site is that there wouldn't be.
But it is classed as Class A land or specialty crop?
You're speaking about Jordan School, correct?
No, I'm talking about the new
Oh, the new
High
school, sorry.
The
Okay.
new West Niagara High School.
Yes, it is. It's identified, but my interpretation of it is because there's currently no agricultural operation happening there, that there's nothing to evaluate impacts to, because it's already not an agriculturally significant area because of predating zoning, predating operations there. But that's my interpretation at this time.
Okay, I was just looking at the layers that were assigned to that property and wondering if there was an opportunity. Thank you.
Are there any other questions, comments? Okay, so I've read the motion. Committee's pleasure on that motion? Thank you. Next item on our agenda is PL 1838, Ministry of Education Pupil Accommodation Review Guideline. I have a motion moved by Councillor Timmers, seconded by Councillor Foster, that the report PL 1838 be received for information. Any questions or comments to the report? Councillor Foster.
Not to the report per se, although there was one line in it there that I found quite interesting and hadn't really thought about this as the new facility is going into play, as we're looking at facilities to go and to partner with, I guess, within the community. It'll be fascinating for council in the future to look at what type of partnerships could potentially be drawn. In the case of the high school that's going in, I know there's been some pretty strong relationships in the past with sports clubs, et cetera, making use of halls and stuff like that. And certainly, some of those types of facilities are a bit lacking within our community. So, it certainly wouldn't be a bad thing for future councils to, as they're getting into this, to look and see if there's options to sort of get in at lower cost type of thing. So.
Mr. CEO.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I think just to touch on that point, I think the council is correct, and I think you're seeing this happen already in a number of other jurisdictions with school boards looking at potential joint facilities, the sharing of facilities. This morning at a meeting with the with the Niagara West mayors and CAOs, one of the conversations was around transit and what role do school boards have in the provision of assisting with transit, similar to what universities and colleges do in terms of helping fund that. But definitely on the recreation side, there's often joint facilities with libraries and recreation centers adjoining schools and so forth. So something definitely that I think just by virtue of new provincial policy guidelines that we can definitely incorporate into whatever conversations we're having with the school board.
Is that good? Very good. Any other questions or comments? I read the motion. Committee's pleasure on that motion? And that motion is carried. Next item on our agenda is a report PL 1839. It is an AMO policy update with regards to cannabis legalization briefing materials. Are there any questions from committee members? I have a motion regarding that report moved by Mayor Easton and seconded by Councillor McPherson. That report PL 1839 be received for information. Councillor Foster?
Sorry, I should have flipped my hand up there a little sooner. Just out of curiosity, and maybe through to the mayor, I don't know if there's been discussions going on at Niagara Region level in this area, but you know, Niagara Region, and I think most municipalities, like major municipalities, went with some pretty strict rules around tobacco smoking. So I don't know if you heard anything. It would seem to me that going down the road with cannabis, it's likely going to either follow the same rules or be very similar in nature. So I don't know if there's anything been stated at the region per se.
Mayor Easton, is there any updates coming from the region?
No, there isn't. There hasn't been anything that I'm aware of. However, I did speak with Dr. Yeager about this, and it's their belief that all forms of, this has gone off, all forms of inhaled products, including the pipes, including the vape mixtures, the traditional tobacco, and also cannabis will eventually all prove to demonstrate that there is cancer as a result of the use of them. So she feels pretty strongly. There hasn't really been very much emphasis, not at the council table.
Okay. Thank you. So I've read that motion. Committee's pleasure on that motion. Thank you. That motion is carried.
Not to the report, but I would like to ask a question under councillor inquiries regarding the cannabis issue.
Okay. Last report for this evening, PL 18-40. Delegation of authority for the release letters of credit for subdivisions. I have a motion moved by Councillor McPherson, seconded by Mayor Easton. And for reasons outlined in PL 1840, it is hereby recommended that the Chief Administrative Officer and the Director of Planning and Development be delegated the authority to reduce and release letters of credit relating to all subdivision and development agreements. Are there any, Councillor Foster?
Just a quick comment on this, and excellent report, excellent motion. This is the right way that policy is supposed to come through for council. Secondly, with this type of thing, and when delegation has been provided within other areas, my assumption is that staff will provide a follow-up report, or it would be part of, for instance, perhaps Director Dale's quarterly reports or whatever, stating what it is that's going on, because again, this is financial matters for the municipality, so it certainly wouldn't be a bad thing to let council understand what has happened, even though we have delegated that decision to them. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. CAO?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I mean, I think the kind of the annual reporting that Kathleen does, this definitely can be one of those items that, and I'm probably speaking for the Director of Planning, we can look at reporting back that way, but the councilor's correct. This, this is the right way of bringing this particular policy forward. So I appreciate both the council's support and comments at the previous meeting that highlighted how we should be bringing this one forward.
Thank you. Mayor Easton?
Mr. Chairman, this is the orderly way to do this, and I just want to make certain that the extension of this includes making sure that developers are held to account earlier, so that we don't find ourselves in a situation where work is not done, where the actual value of the letters of credit diminish over time, and so that we find ourselves in the position of having to do work, but there's really not all the money available to do it that we would like. Is there a connection?
Director Dale?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, whenever a letter of credit is reduced for subdivisions, there's always 25% of the original amount held, which is always more than the outstanding works, and that is held until assumption, and assumption occurs when everything is done.
Okay, so Mr. Chairman, I'm going to just harp on this a little bit because I know that there are, I'll just use Hillside Drive as the example, where there was a great deal of delay. So when it's all said and done, that 25% that was held, is that amount sufficient to do the work that needs to be done in that area?
Director Dale?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, in regards to Hillside Estates, yes, the 25% that we still have would have covered any works that need to be done. In regards to the last thing that needed to be done was the top coat of asphalt, and it was actually staff that asked for that not to be done because there was works being done on Mountain Street and Hickson Street. So that the developer actually would have done that several years ago, but that was delayed by staff while other projects in the area were completed first.
Okay, all right. Well, I think this is a good step out for sure to delegate this responsibility to staff, and we'll see if there are other amendments that have to be made in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? Questions to the motion? Committee's pleasure on that motion? The motion's carried. All motions from this evening's meeting will be presented to council for final approval at its meeting of June 18th, 2018. Following council approval, the enactment of any bylaws that may be necessary, the town's decision will be complete, and a notice will be issued in accordance with the Planning Act. We now have a presentation. I'd like to ask Matt Bruder, the Associate Director of Planning and Development, to provide a presentation regarding Ontario Street visualization. And the CAO would like to preempt the presentation.
Through Mr. Chairman, once I turn on the computer here and make sure I have everything hooked up. But yeah, I just wanted to provide some opening comments in terms of how this came to be. And this probably goes back well over a year ago, and I know committees heard the mayor speak about the Ontario Street visualization and how we need to be and take a mindful approach in planning our communities and planning our major corridors, something that Ms. Dale has led at an SMT level and has supported at an SMT level. And so Matt, Monica, and a number of regional staff last year around this particular time, closer to the end of this month, about a year ago, did a walk down all of Ontario Street, top to bottom, and a number of the adjacent streets and locations to really get a look for how we wanted Ontario Street to develop. I think we can all look at Ontario Street and agree that it's probably in need of some TLC. And so Matt's going to take you through a little bit of an overview, some of the existing conditions we see along Ontario Street, the kind of vision and design principles that were adopted by the region and that we looked at with the region, as well as both some public and private realm strategies that are in place and take into next steps. So from a staff perspective, I can tell you, I don't often get incredibly excited over planning reports. This is one that starts to lay that foundation, and I think starts to highlight for both the public, but more so committee and staff, some of the works that need to be done along Ontario Street.
All right, so yeah, as Mike mentioned, we did a walkthrough, and one of the people that participated on the region side was Cal Doon, who is one of their urban designers, and some of the input he had and some of the things that he identified were really interesting as we went along. So I'll do the best I can to take you through some of those. But kind of an overview and what we were looking at in this particular study area. We kind of looked at the area from, the GO Transit secondary plan area going all the way up to King Street. And we looked at, okay, what's the state of things here? Like we're all pretty familiar with the corridor. We all know its characteristics. We all know some of the things that we perhaps would like to see improved in the area. And then we started thinking about long-term visioning, what's some of the beautification that we can undergo? What are some of the long-term initiatives that we can consider, and what are some of the short-term wins maybe that we can foresee as well? All of this in the context of not only, providing a viable, downtown CBD area, but also, the GO Transit secondary plan area. You've heard in previous reports, we have to get to a point where we're transit ready. We have to develop at a point to encourage ridership, and that's through a certain type of built form, a certain type of environment that attracts people. So moving forward, some of the existing conditions, and I'll kind of start from King Street and move northerly to the GO Transit area. So one of the big and most glaring things right off the bat that we looked at that could really be improved, we looked at Randy Square. In its current state, it's not really place in the sense of what you would identify. It's just a parking lot. It's got a bunch of backs of old buildings where cars are parked every which way, kind of a mishmash of things presently. So we saw an opportunity there that for improvement. So that's one of the things we noticed. There's a lot of streetscaping improvements that could be done. In this particular stretch, though, we will note that some of the more recent development, has brought the buildings closer to the road, part of the urban design guidelines that we want to see, some streetscaping, even a bench. Some of that stuff is starting in this area, so that's a positive. We found a lot of the on-street parking that's there. It's underutilized. It's not very functional. It doesn't really serve a purpose overly well from what we could see. We looked at the tree canopy. There isn't much of one. It's very inconsistent. A lot of times the sides are dominated by overhead utilities among relatively low-rise buildings. There's also some maintenance issues on those buildings. There is issues even, aesthetic-wise when we talk about lighting. I mean, getting down into the downtown area may be a little better, but for the most part along the street, lightings are very conventional, nothing special. Doesn't really give you a sense of place. So these things are not really conducive to creating a vibrant corridor. And then as we move north, going towards Green Lane, we see, some of the blocks are very long, not really conducive to pedestrian access. Streetscape itself is not very attractive visually. You've got a lot of low-rise businesses with a lot of parking in front, very little landscaping or separation between the sidewalk and the road, again, dissuading pedestrian use. A lot of signage present there that congests the overall vista of the streetscape, where, it could be, quite nice just given the overall landscape. We've got a lot of residential uses on the east side, and then we've gotten a lot of more commercial uses on the west side. A lot of the parking lots are conjoined together. Just not very appealing in general, and it's dominated by, heavy focus, mainly because, when you're a pedestrian, you're so close to the road, and that's your main experience other than all the signage. So these are some of the observations that we experienced. So, after having done this walkthrough, we all talked about it, and we talked about, okay, now we know, what's in this area. We knew it already, but, we even had an opportunity to go. There were some sites, I won't mention the business names or anything, they're very underutilized. Only a small portion of them is used. The rest is vacant. It's just not maximizing what could be. So we looked at opportunities, to attract pedestrians, even to attract business. What do we want to do? Well, at the end of the day, we talk about design guidelines. We talk about complete streets. We've been through this before. We talked about this with Prudhome's with respect to, having a more vibrant street corridor where you've got street furniture, you've got a lot of landscape plantings, even going a step further, you even have a more active sidewalk and pedestrian streetscape where you have potential patios that might be available just off the street. The buildings brought closer to the street to develop a better sense of place. I mentioned GO station readiness. That's a big one. We're trying to accommodate for that in the secondary plan, and that translates into this study too, what we're trying to achieve long term. We're trying to achieve a lot of, a little bit more of a compact build form, mixed use type. One use supplements the other. And then there's some other things, some things that stood out to us, and one of those catalytic projects was Ranny Square and what we can do there. And then, we obviously considered U-Link as well, and some of the, the interface with the pedestrians and how that could be maximized. So those are some of the things, some of the touch points we looked at where we thought there could be improvement. So some of the kind of preliminary recommendations, and I want to highlight too, we're at the point here where a lot of this is still in a preliminary form. It's still kind of a high-level overview. We'll be drilling down on some of the details and some of the particular sites later on what we can do. But going forward there, talked about creating a gateway at John and Ontario. Already, we have some streetscaping, some urban design that's appealing on the one side. We have an opportunity overall for that particular area to develop a sense of place. That, as well as the intersection with King Street, there could be some place-making decorations. Again, this is thinking long-term, all options on the table type of thing. Thinking pedestrian crossings, could they be better delineated? We've talked before about colored delineations, possible pavers, installations, even porous pavers, things of the like, whatever. But there's an opportunity there for some added design, some added kind of pizzazz to the area. That could be complemented also in these intersections by some landscape treatments where possible to create a better sense of place, to really give it an identity, and to signify that you're entering into a very vibrant place within the town. We talked about Ranny Square in particular. That there's no reason why that needs to stay the way it is. Could it not be, something where you see the rear facades of the buildings renovated, kind of dressed up? You've seen that before. Maybe there's patios on the backs of them. The parking is a lot more coordinated. We, in our mixed use and residential intensification CIP, when we talk about facade improvements, we talk about front and rear facades. So there's opportunities there. So opportunity to dress that up. Maybe it's not always just a parking lot. Maybe we use it as a gathering place. We even went as far to talk about, what if there's a potential for some property acquisition at some point in the future to make it bigger, make it into more of a marketplace than just a parking lot, making it more of an interactive type place. I have on here, you'll see there's a point of present wine information, and that speaks to the larger context of some of our, our wayfinding signage that we have, opportunities to improve that. We're going to be looking at improving our gateway signage, our wayfinding signage, so that's a reflection of that. Talked about, this on-street parking, it's underutilized, it's not really serving its purpose well. But at the end of the day, we want to be more conducive to active transportation, especially in the context of being from downtown to where a potential GO station might be. Maybe we look at things like, instead of that, maybe we look at Sharrows, something that's a lot more visually appealing to go in line with a streetscape plan to really highlight the corridor. That, along with some, opportunity for redevelopment of some of these lower density existing buildings. Really what we're after is to create a distinctive streetscape that improves active transportation facilities. And we talked too about, this issue with overhead wires and, that being in place of mature street canopy, maybe be changed in the future as well. You know, long-term, we could coordinate with the region. They're the ones that actually brought up with the idea of burying overhead wires, burying utilities in the future just to create a better streetscape. So a lot of these initiatives aren't just coming from us. The region was heavily involved. You know, we talked about it with them at length. The next section, this was already, you know, one of those things where this is, in my opinion, this is where we need a lot of work on the west side in particular. There needs to be some improvements, some beautification, some separation, as I mentioned, between where pedestrians travel and the road. I mean, at the end of the day, it's going to remain a busy road regardless of, you know, long-term considerations, but there are ways that we can make it more conducive and more attractive for pedestrians, which at the end of the day adds to the vibrancy of the corridor. We looked at enhancing medians. You know, a well-designed landscape median can go a long way in, you know, contributing to a improved visual streetscape. There's other ways too. There are certain places, as you can see, there's some indicated here. There's some minimal linkages for pedestrians from outside adjacent communities. Maybe there's perhaps a way to make those more appealing, to make those, to highlight those in a better way so we can get people, channel people into the area where that we see an improved streetscape. And then we talked about, again, moving towards the secondary plan area. There's obviously a big piece of land there on the east side that has a high redevelopment potential too. There's nothing there now. That contributing to a gateway at Green Lane and Ontario Street could really give that particular intersection some presence. We'd also be looking, you know, when I talk about active transportation, bike lanes are always a consideration too. It's just important. That's why I mentioned the sharrows to create a separation, especially on a busy street like this. So, I mean, here's some of, you know, when we talk about the road corridor, just an example of what could be. As you'll see here, you know, what's essentially been done as an example is the vehicular portion has been somewhat pedestrians and amenity space. You can see the light fixtures are much more pedestrian oriented. We've got some plantings in there where we never had before. Just a lot more conducive in terms of accessibility for all, which is what I think should be a big consideration moving forward. So this is the third time I'm mentioning this. It was a big area of focus for us. Here you see just a very high-level concept that Khaldoon put together, just of Randy Square and possibly how it could be somewhat reconfigured. You know, this would include some improvements to the rear facades you see in the bottom right-hand corner there, how they look now, coupled with some plantings to provide some visual barriers. We still have parking in there, but there's a space there that you could use for amenity space too. So this is trying to diversify what's there, beautify it, and make it more of a complement to the downtown area rather than just a parking lot. So some of the private realm stuff, I mean, this is where we get into, you know, encouraging future development, encouraging it in an attractive way, implementing our urban design guidelines, you know, providing CIP grants and incentives where feasible. That's kind of the main focus when we talk about the private realm. This is kind of a more long-term nature as redevelopment occurs. And again, more to that note, more of a compact form of mixed-use development to enliven the streetscape, make it more appealing, make it safer where possible. You know, not have parking all the time in front of the businesses, move them in behind, really showcase what's there. So some of the short-term implications, you know, from a regional standpoint, they had asked us, well, what about the possibility of, you know, a secondary plan for the area to promote some intensification, to maybe promote some land use changes moving forward, to produce a more of the build form that we would want to see along that corridor. Some public realm investment in those areas, which I've talked at length about, to make them more pedestrian friendly, to make them more conducive to some of the complete streets policies that the region has modeled. Redevelopment of Randy Square, application of CIP incentives, as I mentioned before, and then some implementation of some of the key catalytic projects that we spoke about. And then long-term, we look at official plan and zoning to facilitate future development as it occurs. Developing some type of larger streetscape project to really take advantage and focus some of the public realm, maybe investments that we and the region would want to make moving forward. And then even maybe implement some type of development permit system along Ontario Street that would work to streamline an approvals process. Again, this is something that was discussed, that was identified by the region maybe as something that we should look at moving forward, the details of which would follow, but it was brought up at a high level. So that's essentially it. Like I said, this is a long-term visioning exercise. This isn't going to happen overnight, and we're at the point now where we're still at a higher level. Next step would be to drill down into some of the more catalytic projects, some of the areas where we identified in detail here, and come up with some more detailed concepts on maybe how they could look in the future.
Very good. Thank you very much, Matt. That was excellent. Are there any questions from committee? Councillor Foster?
I was listening intently, and I wrote a bunch of things down here that you went through, but I want to start. Who did this report?
The overall visioning, well, Khaldun put it together where a lot of the preliminary, like the high-level mapping and things like that.
Khaldun, who?
His name is Khaldun Ahmed. He worked in infrastructure development at the region. He's an urban designer, yes. We worked alongside him. We participated. We did a SWOT analysis, a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis with him. We worked alongside him. He has a lot of the graphic capacity to make these types of maps, to do these types of things. So.
Okay. I'm not going to criticize it. I think it has a vision where some things are being thought through, and it's going to take a heck of a lot more as we go down the road looking at this. I think I'll quote the mayor on this one, basically stating this is going to be a massive public process that would have to go into play as we move into the future. There's, or I'm sort of paraphrasing the mayor, not quoting the mayor. There is a lot of things in here that you're iffy on the facts as it's going on, and having the benefit of being on council for 18 years and living both the King Street and the Ontario Street reconstruction, there's a few corrections maybe have to be made to the presentation as this moves into the future a little bit. So I am fascinated with the Ranny Square discussion. The presentation was a little harsh, I think, and I know Councillor McPherson is suffering with this, or positively suffering maybe now these days, but BIA was one of the groups involved when we did Ranny Square originally, and the shop owners absolutely refused to get involved, even though the municipality offered incentives to redo the backs of those buildings as it's going on. So there's a whole series of things that are going to have to be thought through going into the future with some of these things, and it's not going to be easy with some of them that are involved. The burying of wires. We made a decision to bury the wires under King Street and also partially down Ontario Street when we were doing the work, and it cost an absolute fortune to do that. I mean, it was also one of the reasons why we chose not to continue up Mountain Street when we were talking about burying wires. It was a difference of almost, almost $250,000 or something like that we were talking about. So, councils in the future, as they're looking at how they're going to improve this, are going to have to keep in mind taxpayers versus the need to do some of these improvements. Anyway, I kind of like where you're going. I'm also going to take one other step back. Back when I was first getting involved with politics here in town, the comment came to me that there are two visions for this community that are going to happen. One is that we're going to have a retail or heavy, like the massive change that's going to go on along Ontario Street in particular, there could be a dramatic change to the way that that street is going to look into the future. That may still be the case. But right now, it's also quite a residential area coming up Ontario Street as well. So there's some big questions that are going to have to be asked to the community as to what the real vision of this is going to be in the future. I don't have the answers to that. I could see where it could go either way as we're going down. But the reality right now is that it's residential. And so, again, there's going to have to be a significant process to figure some of these things out. There's a bunch of other things within it as well that some other point. But anyway, I think it's good getting it out on the table, but this is just the start. I mean, my goodness, this is a huge undertaking for the council going into the future. So, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I have Councillor McPherson and then Mayor Easton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I like what I'm seeing. I think you got to start with this sort of vision and throw something on the paper and see where you take it from there. Is it a huge project? Absolutely. Have we got some of it done? I think we've got some of it done with the GO Train secondary plan that, I think in the one diagram you show it almost to John Street, King Street, or John Street to Green Lane. Is that?
Yeah, that's correct.
So in there, we've got the build, in all of the how, if a developer came along and said, I want to buy this piece of property in that secondary plan, we could move forward with a live, work, whatever, right off the sidewalk, right? So we could start building it in pieces. I mean, are you going to do this overnight? Absolutely not. So, I applaud your group for having this vision, and I think this is where it starts to make that change, because I think we all agree we drive down Ontario Street and we're disappointed. It just is a mishmash of different buildings, different colors, different styles. So I think to create this gets developers excited, and gets people engaged in, hey, if I happen to purchase a piece of property, I can start doing some pretty cool things. So I like it overall. Rennie Square, I would be certainly open to ideas around Rennie Square. I think there is absolutely some frustrations with the business owners down there, and what ownership they have for the property and the lack of change. So again, if we can create a vision of what it could be, and if we can accommodate the employees that are parking there somewhere else, I think we can make a change to that. I guess I'm somewhat unclear as to what Khaldun is thinking that would be, other than a nice parking lot. I guess I'm really kind of wondering where he's going with that. But I like where you're going, Matt. It's someplace to start. That's what I see here. It's a let's start talking about it, and let's get something out there. Maybe in the next term to really get people energized about what changes could be made to Ontario Street. So nice job. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome, Councillor. Mayor Easton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have a very major interest in this project. And my interest stems back probably to maybe when Councillor Foster first came on council, which is when things started to happen in town. And it is very hard to introduce change to people who have had things the same for a long time. And the planning process works very well for that, the planning process. But it doesn't really address in any appreciable way what people think about where they work and where they live and what it all looks like and how it makes them feel. So this is a big deal for me. This policy direction is something, it's why I believe that people should have more input. And I know it takes more time, and I know that it's very labor intensive, and it costs more money and staff time. But at the same time, in Lincoln, because of the staff investment in dealing with the public, we are not in the same situation that Grimsby and Pelham and other places are in, where there is this just head-to-head battle going on with any kind of change in the community. So Khaldoun did this off the end of his desk. It did not cost us direct money. It wasn't a matter of, it was a matter that the commissioner and I had had a chat after Mike and I had had a chat, and they allowed Khaldoun to do this because they felt that Lincoln had the right attitude about change and that it was possible for us to introduce something here because of the direction we were going that other communities weren't embracing. So for me, this is a tremendously enlightened approach. And I'm not so worried about what it says, but what it portrays. In terms of the kind of attitude, as people have been saying, as my colleagues have said, it's about the kind of attitude that we will adopt if we look at this and say, here's a chance to enter into a conversation with the public and to take the risks that go along with people saying no or maybe or yes. And we had that when we were dealing with Prudhome's. And when you come right down to it, there really wasn't any risk at all. To going to people and saying, here's a blank piece of paper, what's the most important thing about this project? I can't think of one risk except it took a long time. That really wasn't a risk. You could either spend a lot of time on the project, or you could spend time fighting with people or giving them reasons why it ought to be a different way. So to me, this is like opening the door and just letting the sunshine in terms of how we're going to operate in the future. But we're not going to do it without our eyes wide open, because this is, if we go this route, it is going to be different and it's going to cost more money. And I think that those are the realities of it. So everything that everybody has said is correct. It's a matter of where, how we're going to position it. So I am delighted that this has come forward. It's taken a year, and it was like a year ago May, he started working on this. And it's not just for Beamsville. We already had this in Jordan. EA's already been done. It's taken far too long. Now we've come to the realization at the region that when you're hiring consultants, the consultants have to be in their mind where you are. And there's no point in hiring road consultants if the road consultants want to plan something that you don't want. So now we've had all these tremendous delays. So we're going to have to be careful about who we select. I think we were pretty careful about who we selected for Prudhome's. Quartech thought they were just going to come in and it was going to be business as usual. Certainly used elements of the original secondary plan. It was a different approach, for sure. So attitude that involved the public more in the grand plan, using all of our policies as a guide. What is more desirable, Mr. Chairman, than to know we've got all these policies in place, we've been testing them. We know what works, we kind of know what doesn't work. We can start coming up with a local initiative and bring people together and let them look at this and start asking questions and finding out that maybe there's a better way to do it than having the developer come and say, we're going to put 15 stories up here, and then the battle begins. It is such nonsense. But they need to know what the zoning allows, and they maybe need 8 or 10 times to get it through their head what that is going to look like. So I find this all very enlightening, and it shows, I think, that our community is very mature in the way we look at public consultation. I like the idea of the development permit system. I like the idea of developers being involved and having their say, but I also like the idea that they are not just going to come with something that they want, but something that they know is going to be acceptable. So that is all going to be part and parcel of this. But as I said before, I see the same thing happening in Vineland, and this is going to be momentum. So we talked about Ontario Street. We didn't really look at Main Street in Beamsville, but of course, you know, we're looking at that as well. So I just, I don't know what the next steps are. I guess I would like to see a little bit more information about what that chronology would look like. You know, what would that framework look like? Not to say that we shouldn't do it, but that we should find the way to do it and the way forward. And I hope that we can adopt that. I hope that we will feel positive about this and take this risk, because it does mean that we're going to have to be spending a lot of time with people. I actually think our community want this. I think this is what they're telling us. And how are they telling us? Because of the amount of time that our staff are spending with people on many, many issues. They want to be involved in the solutions. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for the time.
Thank you. Councillor Renjema.
Thank you, Chair Thompson. I've got positive things to say about it too. I think it's a really good vision. I think it's a great step to take. It's big things that we undertake are never simple. I love the Ranny Square idea. I love the idea that the downtown, I've always sort of envisioned it turning the corner and coming down to John Street. Again, it's just, these are high level ideas. How you make them happen, time will tell. I also like the development permit system idea. I know a little bit about that, and I think it's something I'd like to hear more about and how we can make that work. It's going to be interesting to see through the process how we see the balance of public and private investment going into this. I believe that public investment in the downtown has had positive spin-offs. We've seen it. I think it will continue to have a positive spin-off. So I'm excited about it. I think it's a great idea, and I appreciate the initiative that everybody's taking.
Thank you very much. Mr. Danny, do you have commentary?
I do. Thank you, Chair. Through you to the committee. You know, it was with a lot of excitement that I saw not only the presentation tonight, but obviously when the region did do a presentation for us staff in regards to the visioning exercise. You know, I think, and I think my colleagues can agree that, you know, this is a bold plan that obviously will take time. But I think arguably this is another generational project that we are facing here in town. And I do think we need to, you know, think a little bit differently in terms to spur some change and investment, not only in downtown, but along the Ontario Street corridor. So part of this vision exercise is to sell it both to the community, but also to developers and investors looking at opportunities within town. And this visioning exercise does present one of those opportunities. In addition to that, you know, myself, the CEO, and Mr. Bruder have actually been already working with trying to sell some of this visioning, and we're in the hopes of sort of locking in an investor into downtown and bring one of those catalyst projects that Mr. Bruder was referring to that will help change or spur change on Ontario Street. So we hope to have some good news in the near future on that, but at the end of the day, as I mentioned, you know, this will go a long way towards not only redeveloping King Street, but also Ontario Street as well. So bold thinking and action will be the name of the game. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much, Mr. Danny. I just wanted to comment that I'm just pleased to see that staff is putting forward things that are not normally what we would expect, you know. there's some way out thinking, some future thinking, some, bold ideas that maybe would have never come from staff to councils in report form. And so I'm really pleased by that. So it's exciting to see us taking a leap like this. Mr. CIO?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, if I could just provide what maybe is some closing comments on this, and thank the staff that have been involved in doing this. One of the things that committee will have heard me say on a number of occasions is that we need to ready the community for change. And I think this is one of those things that is going to require a lot of public consultation. I heard comments around framework. It will require a framework, but too often I think we're reactive, and we're reactive by the nature we've got a lot of work to do. This is one of those proactive things that is a number of years in the making, but if you don't ready the community for the change that is coming, and I don't mean change that we're leading per se, I mean the inevitable change with whether it be the market, with whether it be the business climate, whatever it is, you're going to find yourself reacting to that change, and that isn't positive. And I think we see that in parts of the broader region. We see that outside of our own particular region. So readying the community for change, and I think we've done that with some success over the last number of years on some key projects. Councillor mentioned hydro as an example, and not to use that one in particular because I'm very familiar with what transpired over the number of years here in talking to both NPEI and the region, but we do have other partners at the table that we can definitely go to, and this is a regional road. NPEI has a very different philosophy, I would say, over the last number of years in terms of climactic events, climate change, and what that means to burying of wires. And so while there is a cost, when we look at a 10 to, I'll throw a number out there, but when we look at millions of dollars in road rehabilitation and what the long-term costs are potentially for NPEI in terms of storms and the frequency of the 100-year storm that seems to be happening every year now, they're also looking at putting monies in, and we've had some of these conversations just generally speaking as it relates to Jordan or other particular developments on wire. So both NPEI and the region, I think, will be at the table. But I say that to say, and to end with, there's a public and a private piece here, and I think we just need to be ready for when that particularly happens. And so, of course, there's always monies that municipalities need to put in, and that will be a bigger conversation with both councils and the community when we look at service and service delivery and what people want in those particular areas and what our business community wants. But absolutely something that I think is exciting to see where it could potentially go, but is one of those 1 to 2 term type initiatives that we're going to see over the next number of years.
Thank you very much, Mr. CIO. Seeing no further comments, I have a motion moved by Councillor Timmers and seconded by Councillor Foster that the presentation regarding Ontario Street visualization be received. Committee's pleasure on the motion? Thank you. That motion is carried. Thank you, Matt. Appreciate the presentation. So that was the last of the reports. The mayor had a councillor inquiry. I will go to the mayor for her councillor inquiry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. There's been quite a bit of circulated information, I think particularly through AMO, regarding bylaws that are being considered by municipalities. And this work has been done in advance of the changes in legislation. And I know that we have at least 2 major problems with greenhouses that are operating as the growers based on the prescription model. These are not pharmaceutical grade at all, but these are greenhouses where we would all take our prescriptions and give them to the owner. I'm not sure if that's the right procedure, but at any rate, a person is now growing for all of us. And the one on, I think it's 13th Street, 13th or 15th, in that area anyway. The smells are very, very bad, and there's been a lot of complaints. So my question is, what are these bylaws that people are passing about setbacks and all of this kind of thing? And how is it that they are able to actually implement these? Do we think that they might even be legal? How can we find out whether we're ahead of the game or where we're supposed to be, or whether we're really behind? Because people, I mean, some municipalities have been working really hard at this, and I'm not sure how to judge whether or not we're able to, whether we have the capability to respond effectively to the complaints that are coming forward. That's my question. And I don't need the answer tonight. I just would like it tabled as a question for consideration.
Very good. I think staff has duly noted that. Councilor McPherson?
And I would echo those comments, as well as you know, anytime I'm being asked about issues around smell and things like that, yeah, I really have nothing that I can give them. You know, I'm hearing it's federal, and you know, that's all, you know, where the legislation's coming from, but yet, you know, we're impacting our own residents with the local goings on of the industry. So, you know, I fully support to find out what can we do to react to situations that are coming at us now and will grow, you know, as these operations start to expand.
Mr. CAO?
Through Mr. Chairman, just to make a brief comment, and I think, you know, to the mayor's point and Councillor McPherson's, I think that, so there has been some movement in terms of approvals and so forth, and so I think now that both OMAFRA's, you know, released their policy documents, as well as some of the proposed changes around Bill C-45, I think there is more of a willingness to meet. We've been reaching out, and there seems to be a massive reluctance from OMAFRA to sit down with us at this particular point in time. So I think there's more of a willingness to meet now. You know, the one thing that I would note is that I think with the new government, potentially, probably the rules around cannabis may change as well. And so I think that's just another potential caveat that we need to be cognizant of. But I think from a staff perspective, I know both Mr. Deaney and Mr. Bruder have had conversations with OMAFRA. And so we'll get better, you know, we'll get together and we'll get a better communication out to council in terms of where things stand.
Okay.
Oh, you go ahead.
Madam Mayor?
Mr. Chairman, presently, are there any, is there anything in the property standards bylaw that can be applied in these situations where there are smells?
Through you, Mr. Chair, there might be with respect to, you know, refuse or any kind of waste or what have you that's sitting on the property, but in terms of odors resulting from an operation such as that, you know, it's federally regulated, there's nothing in our property standards bylaw that would afford us any action.
And so, Mr. Chairman, I just want to make sure that we get a few of these things included in the report. Where municipalities have passed bylaws to ensure that filters are used, filters are in place, is that a federal regulation as well? Through you, Mr. Chairman?
I believe it is, Madam Mayor, yes. But I'm not, in complete honesty, I'm not sure how it applies in each specific case. That's something that I could take away and provide you with a more accurate response.
Okay, all right. I'll just leave it at that, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Councillor?
Yes, thank you. And I want to ask again about the Tickerelli property in the downtown, and you know, I certainly don't want to be here every month asking for an update. But you know, I think that there certainly is a level of suspicion that nothing's happening. and that things just being delayed as a result of the owner's decision to delay. So I'm wondering if there isn't, you know, through you, Mr. Chair, to the staff, if there isn't some kind of update, some kind of formal update that we could do, you know, particularly as it would apply to the BIA potentially, as here's where we're at. And here's how often we communicate with the owner. Here's the process that we're going through. You know, here's our expectation of when that will finish. And here's, you know, what will happen after that. That, you know, if all goes well, the way will be clear, and then we can put proper pressure on the owner to do something in the downtown, because, you know, equipment is sitting there, you know, in the same location for days and days and weeks and months. And, you know, we're now 2 years, 3 years down the road. I'm not sure how long we are down the road since the old Mr. Convenience came down, a couple anyway. So I get asked on a regular basis, you know, not every BAA meeting I go to, but there is certainly a question as what's going on. So through you, Mr. Chair, to maybe Mr. Deanne has something to say about it.
I think actually, yeah, whoever wants to.
Well, thank
Go
you,
ahead.
Chair, through you to the committee member, and I will let Director Dale further clarify the point here, but my understanding is that as with any remediation process, there's a post-remediation phase, which my understanding is they're currently in the post-remediation phase, or monitoring, which does allow some, it does take some time. So Kathleen is shaking her head, so I may have that incorrectly. But in terms of the BIA standpoint, I know Stephanie has been or the BIA director, executive director has been in contact with many of the businesses along that course, so I can't speak to her to see if she has any update in terms of timeline once everything has been approved. So I will speak to her on that, but I will turn it over to Director Dale for clarification.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, the good thing is the applicant did do his last round of environmental testing, and it did come back clean. So he has to do another test in approximately maybe 2.5 months. It was a couple weeks ago that he let us know that, you know, the site is finally considered by the Ministry of Environment to be clean. Test. He's going through a site plan approval process. The problem is when you have a site like that, you can't even issue a building permit until the next 3 months are up and there's a record of site filed. So there's paperwork that he has to go through to satisfy Ministry of Environment before he can get to the point of getting site plan approval and getting a building permit.
So if we are getting close by the sounds of it, so 2.5 months down the road, we're talking, you know, August, September. How long generally does it take for the ministry to then get back to them with a, you're good to go or you're not? Do you have any experience with that?
Director?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, if they file the paperwork properly with the Ministry of Environment, the record of site process, there's a time frame that the ministry has to respond to that and approve it. So if they do everything correctly, I believe the time frame is about a month.
So if we are to stay close to the owner over the next few months and continue to encourage them to move as quickly as possible, this thing could be clear to go in late September, early October from a getting through that part of the process. And then we'd have to go to whatever we have to do next, detailed design or whatever that would be.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, the applicant can do his site plan approval building permit applications. He can get everything in place so that when his paperwork is approved by the ministry,
He's
we're
ready to
able
go.
to issue a building permit.
Perfect.
So he
Okay.
can run those processes parallel.
Okay, that's encouraging. Thank you.
Is there anybody else with any councillor inquiries this evening? Even though she's not on the committee, we will allow her to make an inquiry, Councillor. Go ahead, Diane.
Thank you, Chair Thompson. My question is about the Prudhoe secondary plan approval process. I'm wondering if we have any information on where that is and at the region and what the next steps are, timelines.
Is that one you're going to have to get back to Councillor Benjamin? Okay.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, the region has taken a report to one of their committee meetings in July. I don't know the exact date. I think it was the 18th, but it's one of their committee meetings in July.
Great, thanks. And also, when does the appeal process begin? Did it begin the day this council approved the secondary plan, or does it begin the day that the region approves the secondary plan?
I'll help you with that. Through you, Mr. Chairman, the appeal period goes from when the region puts their notice of decision in the mail, and it's 20 days from when they mail out that notice. It's not when they actually make the decision, it's when the notice is issued, and the notice of approval. So that will take you into about, because also if it goes to committee the 1 week, it goes to council, I think, the following week. You're probably looking at the appeal period expiring near the end of August, so the 3rd, 4th week of August.
Makes sense. Okay, thank you.
Are there any other councillor inquiries? I have a councillor inquiry with regards to where we are with the appeal period on Bench's application. Where are we at day-wise? And has there been anything come forward? Mr. Bruder?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I'll have to my knowledge, nothing has come through yet, but I'll have to get back to you on the specifics on that just to make sure. So I think it's closed now, yeah, but I'll have to, like I said, I want to verify.
All right, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Okay. Are there any notices of motion this evening? Any announcements? I have no closed session. And therefore, due to the fact there's no further business, I call this meeting adjourned. Thank you. At 9:24, Mr. Clerk / CAO.